Oculus by Thistle. Chapter 4 Terrible Things. "Hey Kyle," a voice shouted happily. A pair of red sneakers squeaked to a stop before him, and Kyle smiled. It was the first day of 8th grade, and he hadn't seen any of the faces drifting by since the previous school year. Well, the face grinning back at him was an exception. He saw it every day of summer break. "Hey Stan," he greeted in return. "Ready for school?" In a voice of pure excitement and elation, Stan blurted, "Fuck no." Kyle laughed, and the pair continued down the hall side by side. "You know, I have more classes with Cartman than with you this year," Kyle groaned. "Your first period is math, right?" "Yeah," Stan sighed in return. "How about you?" "Astronomy." "Isn't that a class for the high schoolers?" Kyle shrugged. "I guess so, but they let me start early because of my GPA." "Well, look at you, Mr. Honor Roll's moving on up." "Oh, here's room 112. That's Algebra 1. Kyle interrupted as he pointed at the white painted numbers over a black door frame. "I guess this is my stop then. Have fun learning about space or whatever it is you do in astronomy," Stan said while walking towards the door. "Oh, wait a minute. I almost forgot." Kyle tilted his head to the side in curiosity as he watched his best friend dig through his messenger bag. When Stan was through, he held his hand out. "What is it?" Kyle asked with a dumb smile on his face. He reached his palm out under Stan's fist. When it opened, a small gift landed in Kyle's hand. "A present. I have one too," Stan said as he pulled up his sleeve to showcase a red and blue bracelet made of weaved yarn. They're friendship bracelets. "Did you make them?" Kyle asked as he slipped his onto his wrist. It was weaved with green and white, Kyle's favorite colors. "Yeah, my sister taught me last night," Stan said proudly. "Gay," Kyle snorted. "Good, you should fucking love them then, you dick," Stan snickered with a loop-sided smirk. "Hey, gotta go. I'll see you and the guys at lunch, yeah?" "Yeah." Kyle never admitted it, but he was always nervous the first day back to school. His anxiety only grew when he watched the door to room 112 close behind his best friend's back. Sighing, he joined the stream of students to look for his first class alone. Anxiously, he reached down and rubbed the yarn around his wrist. Tweak sat in the back of class. There was no one beside his desk and no one in front of it. It was almost as if he was being quarantined or exiled for his abnormality, banned from the teenage experience. Though in all honesty, he didn't appear to mind. He just sat there at his desk, taking turns between jotting down notes and scribbling in a sketchbook. Kyle never really noticed until then. Sure, he always knew Tweak was there, but like the rest of the school, he never really bothered to stop and pay attention. Now, it's all he could think about. 3 English classes had passed since their odd meeting at the coffee shop. In those 3 days, he and Butters pulled an all-nighter studying. Kenny and Eric swore not to talk to each other ever again for the 5th time, and another article appeared in the paper about the Shadow Man and his holes. So in other words, everything was just as it was before Kyle's terrifying reunion with Craig Tucker. Everything except for his dreams. His once pleasant sleep had been invaded by vivid visions of murky water and collapsing lungs, pus oozing eye sockets and shredded fingertips. He supposed that's what he got for leeching a vision off of such a spiritually toxic person such as Tweak, but he didn't mean to. Kyle's tired green eyes slid towards the lonely desk at the back of class. Tweak was there, as always, with mud-caked boots and a graphite stain on the outside of his right hand. He bit his chapped lip as he scribbled in that worn-out sketchbook. Kyle only wondered what dark and disturbing things he would find in the personal drawings of the Shadow Man. He shook his head with a small sigh, and then averted his attention back to the front of the class. The teacher's soft-spoken voice and airy movements didn't at all help her drowsy student keep his heavy eyes open.
His head slowly drooped down over his notes. The words on his notebook paper all ran together and faded in and out as he yawned. Kyle? Kyle? He stirred at the sound of his name, his eyes cracking back open to discover an empty classroom. He jolted up from his desk. His cheek was wet and cold from where he'd managed to drool all over his classwork and himself. His teacher, Miss Langley, was looking down at him with a worried expression. "Oh," he stammered while wiping at his cheek with his sleeve. "Shoot, I'm so sorry. What time is it?" Miss Langley's frown melted into a humored quirk of the lips. "Class only just ended," she assured him calmly. "Crap, I didn't finish my notes," he spat. The honor roll student was careful to censor himself even as he was having a miniature meltdown. Don't worry, Miss Langley said, while tucking a black hair behind her ear. "I can give you a copy of the overview when you come in tomorrow. Just be sure to get a lot of sleep tonight, okay?" Relieved, Kyle quickly gathered up his belongings and shoved them in his binder. He supposed being teacher's pet did have its upsides. "Thank you so much, Miss Langley. It won't happen again, I promise." All she did was offer an understanding nod before returning to her desk. Kyle squeezed his binder against his chest as he stumbled towards the hall. Stumbled because he stepped on something rather thick and nearly went tumbling. He looked down at the bound stack of papers which were still under the sole of his shoe. He bent down and lifted the thing up off the floor. It had a shiny white cover adorned with the words "Sketch Diary." Under the neat font was a name sloppily written and underlined in red Sharpie. Tweak Tweak. Kyle felt a bubbling in his chest when he realized just what was in his hands. Tweak's sketchbook. His blood pumped about 1,000 times quicker as excitement tightened in his chest. Miss Langley was giving him an odd look as he gawked at the thing, but she didn't bother to question him when he tucked it against his binder and spilled out into the hall with the rest of the hustling students. He stopped at his locker, number 153, before switching out his materials for the next class. All his materials, anyway, aside from a peculiar sketchbook. He kept it hidden in his binder like contraband. When he reached his next class, AP Biology, he sat as far away from his group as their shared table would allow. He wasn't too worried about unwanted conversation. Wendy Testaberger was assigned the seat beside him. She spent most of her time absorbed in her schoolwork. Lately, she'd been so absorbed it was almost frightening. Kyle understood why. She wouldn't be bothered with trying to speak with him today. He unzipped the Trapper Keeper as Wendy exchanged notes with Annie, the third member of their class-assigned group. When the flaps of his binder fell open, the cover of Tweak's sketchbook greeted him. His eyes darted around the rows of students, as if he was about to commit a crime. His fingers pressed against the front cover, and then he carefully flipped it open to the first page. Grotesque images of mutilated corpses and depictions of the gory dead? No, that was a little off the mark. Instead, Kyle was met face to face with an oddly cartoony depiction of a tiny boy in a sweater. There were black blotches where his eyes should have been, but otherwise it was just, well, adorable. A happy little line made a smile between the black eyes, and some pudgy wisps of black made up the hair poking out from under an ear flap hat. The cute little creature seemed elated by his pretty sweater. Realizing that almost made Kyle laugh. He flipped to the next page, then the next, and then the next. They were all just pictures of sweaters. Some of them were modeled by the same chunky cartoon boy on the front page, and others weren't. There was one thing they all had in common, though. Chicken scratch abbreviations and numbers written on the side of every page. Thanks to how much time Kyle spent with his mother, he knew exactly what they were. Knitting patterns. All the while, Kyle was quietly pondering the horrors Tweak was creating on the blank paper of that book. He was only designing yarn sweaters. Kyle continued flipping casually through the pages. He observed sweater after colorful sweater, along with joyous doodles of bouquets and cartoon cats.
As he flipped and flipped, his humorous smile slowly melted into an uneasy line. There wasn't a single thing in that book that was going to tell him anything. The nightmares that had been plaguing him, the twisted beings that hunted him down in the forest, and Tweak himself still remained blurred and confusing mysteries. He was so devastated, he didn't even hear the teacher greeting the class. He just went back to the first page and started skimming all over again, as if maybe he missed something. He came to a nerve-wracking conclusion by the time he'd again reached the end of Tweak's Happy Doodles. There was only one way to end the vivid visions in his dreams. He had to talk to Tweak. Tweak's boots thumped against worn wood as he paced the room. It was musty and old, just like the rest of the house he dubbed his home away from home. Not that he wanted to. There was a large piece of paper tacked over the crumpled floral wallpaper, a map of Stark's Pond. It hung there for as long as he inhabited that place. Over time, its once crisp white image had been scribbled over and written on in various types of markers and pens. Big circles and X's mostly. They marked the holes he'd dug, and the holes he went back and dug deeper. He stared wide-eyed as he gnawed at his thumbnail. What was he missing? He skimmed over the waterfront in the woods, its borders and landmarks scribbled in like Tweak's X and O's. Where? It was only about 4 o'clock. He had all day to figure out his next excavation site, but all day was not long enough. Weeks and months were not long enough. 5 years was not long enough. 5 fucking years digging, and he still hadn't found it. There were so many times he nearly tossed his shovel in a dumpster. One of those times, he ended up reeking like trash. His boots changed direction, and he rubbed his sleeve against the dirty glass of a window. He peered down from the second story at the yard below. Craig was there, crawling slowly through the grass. Tweak's lip quirked up when he noticed a blonde head peek around the trunk of a tree. Craig noticed too, and quickly scurried along the ground to attempt to jump on the apparition before it could stumble away. Despite how much it took out of Tweak to be at the pond, it was always a breath of fresh air to see Craig get to play with other children. Though, he was never quite sure exactly what it was they played. Craig, on the other hand, knew every rule of the game. He may have been completely blind, but he had other means of finding the kids during their many hide-and-seek adventures. Usually, he was the one to seek. The game never ended when he was the one to hide. Craig's fingers scraped along the bark of a tree before he pounced. He was sure he'd land on the other boy. He could hear soft breathing nearby. However, his hands and knees landed playfully against the exposed roots of the trees. Confused, Craig turned his head as if he could see if he just tried hard enough. He could hear someone nearby, feel the faint vibrations of feet through the dirt and roots. They felt like the vibrations he used to feel through the headboard. He knew what was coming, and there was no escape. He lifted his head up, but it was jerked back down when the boy he'd originally been tracking jumped playfully on his back. A pair of arms wrapped loosely around his neck, and Craig immediately screamed. Not the howl of joyful play he usually let out, but a yelp that truly sounded terrified. The boy was knocked off Craig's back as the gory creature thrashed across the ground. He realized what he was doing, but was powerless to stop it. Once it began, it wouldn't stop until it was done with him. Tweak was still inside, unaware of the ongoing battle Craig was fighting. He marked on his paper and sighed to himself. It was then he heard a rattle at the window. He lifted his head up from his work and waited a moment until the glass in the window panes began to vibrate. He heard the collective murmur of distressed voices and ran to the window. The children were standing in a circle in the backyard. He watched through the grimy glass with squinted eyes as they joined hands. A tiny body was in the middle, thrashing across the grass. Tweak called it a healing circle because that's exactly what it was.
The children would make such a circle under one circumstance. Craig was on the edge of a mental breakdown. "Shit," Tweak hissed before turning and running through the house. He could never resist the urge to run to Craig's rescue, even when he knew there was nothing he could do. He ran out into the yard, nearly tripping over his own feet as they pumped underneath him. The children were singing, but their happy sounds were not soothing Craig as they always had before. Tweak stopped only feet away from their playful circle. They all slowly span around and around, giggling and cooing, singing and playing. Tweak watched with hitched breath as Craig struggled to stand. He was trying so hard to focus on the children's voices, but the groan of springs echoed much louder. They couldn't save him this time. He felt big hands all over him, warm, intrusive hands that scraped at his skin, raw with every touch. He felt heavy breath seeping stench into his neck. His jaw hung open, as if he could beg for mercy, but his mouth was full of jagged teeth. The children's ritual that always saved Craig from reliving his torment was failing. He couldn't hear their voices anymore. All he felt was the breath in his ear. All he heard was a low, raspy whisper. The children all scattered in opposite directions when Craig's panic gave way to violence. Tweak watched on in horror as little Craig lurched and tried to escape. Blind, he slammed headfirst into the trunk of a tree. His skull smashed against the resilient wood, but that disgusting puffing was still heaving into his flesh. "It's not real, Craig," Tweak tried to convince the boy, as he fought to escape an attacker that simply wasn't there. Craig was crying, loud. Tweak could hardly stand the sound. "It's okay," Tweak said, as he quickly rushed to the other's aid. Rather than reply, Craig jerked back and bashed his head against the bark. "Stop!" Tweak demanded, as he tried to scoop the boy up in his arms. He was met with an ear-busting screech. It sounded pained, as if each of his touches seared Craig's skin. Alarmed, Tweak let Craig fall back onto the ground, where he twisted and kicked at an unseen force. "Make it stop," Craig retched in a voice that didn't belong to him. "I can't breathe. Kill me." Tweak couldn't fucking take it anymore. Craig never had an attack that bad, and Tweak realized he was absolutely powerless. All he could do was stand and watch as Craig was forced to endure his defilement over again. Tweak fell to his knees as Craig again rammed his skull against the tree. He had to do something. He at least had to try. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," Tweak sang through his wavering, cracking voice. "How I wonder what you are." The words did nothing to spare Craig from his torment. All they did was meld miserably with the little ghost's booming pleas for mercy. "Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky." It didn't help, but Tweak couldn't stop. He just kept mimicking the children's song. "When the blazing sun is gone, when the nothings shine upon." Craig's bone-snapping contortions slowed. His neck snapped around with a crack. Two red, gushing holes stared back at Tweak. A lump formed in the middle of Tweak's throat at the grotesque sight, but his trembling lips continued on. "Then you show your little light, twinkle, twinkle all the night." Craig's sobbing returned to him as his twisted mess of limbs straightened themselves out. He scrambled across the ground on his bloody hands and knees, right into Tweak's open arms. The choked and miserable cries didn't stop, but Craig's shredded fingers were back to stroking Tweak's face. The usually black, tar-lined insides of Craig's eye sockets were red and meaty. Fleshy strands hung from the holes, as if they'd only just been carved out of his head. Streaks of fresh blood made lines down his white skin, but it wouldn't stop gushing from the inside of his legs. I'm just gonna wipe you off. Is that okay? Tweak said. He pulled off his jacket, being careful not to startle the small boy still whimpering near his face. He bundled up the cloth and gently brought it to Craig's cheeks. The sobbing stopped when the little boy felt the familiar smelling cloth, though Tweak was too shaken to smile this time. Once the gore had been wiped away from Craig's face, Tweak brought the crimson-stained cloth to the boy's blood-streaked and trembling thighs. The moment the jacket pressed against his fragile skin, the boy broke back out into heartbreaking sobs. His small hand grabbed Tweak's wrist, and he shook his head hard, begging for it to stop. No, I'm sorry. Tweak cried out as he tossed the jacket aside. His cheeks were streaked with wet tears, though he was too absorbed in the sound of Craig's screaming to notice. He carefully pulled the broken boy into his lap, where he loosely held him against his chest and rocked back and forth. We're okay now, Tweak promised while nodding his head. Craig's tiny fingers clutched on to the front of Tweak's shirt. Fresh blood again overflowed from where he was most afraid of being touched. It left grisly streams of red slathered across his legs and dirty white shirt. It spilled all over Tweak, too, as he held the boy against his chest. He didn't care. He just stayed there, rocking back and forth while rubbing Craig's back. We're okay. We're fine. Nobody can hurt you now. Class had been over for a couple of hours by the time Kyle got around to going to Tweak's house. Or at least what he hoped was still Tweak's house. He only remembered Kenny casually mentioning it once as they drove by in middle school, so he hoped he wasn't going to end up knocking on a stranger's door. His sneakers thumped against wood as they stepped up onto the porch. Wind chimes sang pleasant songs as they were caught in a light breeze. They twinkled over his head. The house seemed nice enough. The yard was well trimmed, and there was a colorful patio set arranged on the porch. Trim and neat, like most all of the houses on the block. He tugged the strap of his backpack. The sketchbook was inside, along with a few other of his personal belongings. He sucked in a steady breath, then walked up to the wooden door. There was a stained glass window nestled into the oak, though he couldn't see through it. He tapped his knuckles against the door, then waited with a lump in his throat. The door came open so soon Kyle jumped. There was a woman on the other side. Her hair was cut into a short bob, and her blue eyes gazed down pleasantly at Kyle. He recognized her immediately. Miss Tweak, the woman who owns the coffee shop with her husband. Oh, she said with a small smile. Kyle, right? The little Broflovsky boy? Always gets 2 coffees with 2 scoops of vanilla creamer each. Yes, I remember. Kyle could only nod his head politely as he squeezed on the straps of his backpack. This was indeed Tweak's house. So, what can I do for you, young man? Oh yeah, he uttered rather awkwardly, while fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. Is Tweak home? The dark-haired woman behind the door looked down at him with a lost expression. Tweak? She questioned, as if maybe she didn't hear him right. Yeah, I need to talk to him about one of our classes. Kyle didn't like lying, but if he told her about the sketchbook, she'd probably just suggest he leave it with her. Well, of course, anytime, she said before the decorated door creaked closed. Well, there went that idea. Tweak wasn't home, but Kyle wasn't the kind to give up so easily. He stepped off the Tweak's porch, making a mental list of all the places Tweak might be. Not that he really had any idea. When he stopped to think about it, he hadn't ever noticed seeing Tweak out and about around town. Not that he could remember anyway. First he checked the park, then the grocery store, then the gas station, then the coffee shop. Having no luck, he took an uneasy stroll down one of South Park's few streets.
He was debating with himself whether or not he should follow it to the end. There was one place left on his mental checklist. He put it at the bottom for a reason, and that reason was because he did not want to go back. Of course, while walking the streets, he made sure not to peek up at certain houses. It was easy to get discouraged and want to go home when he'd see figures watching him from windows. It was just part of his gift. He saw them when they wanted to be seen, whether he liked it or not. The only way to avoid it was, well, to not look. The church came into view as he nervously made his way towards the pond. It stood beautifully amongst tall green pines, though the sidewalk had been cracking and crumbling over time. The cement was so broken up and uneven, he had to step up and down jarred chunks of sidewalk. The sky was changing colors as the sun made its sleepy descent into the mountains, and Kyle was quickly reconsidering. He bit down on his lip when he saw the glistening blue water in the distance. Air got harder to suck in the closer he got. The power that place held was overwhelming. He couldn't help but feel like bugs were skittering around beneath his flesh. He ran his fingernails over his arm for a moment, and then squeezed his yarn bracelet. "Okay," he said to himself as he came to the gravel parking lot. "We aren't going into the woods, so don't be scared. We're just peeking at the pond, and then we're gonna run back home. Yeah." He passed a trash can as he stepped onto the path that led down to the water's edge. His eyes scanned the grassy landscape for any signs of life. Much to his shock, there were people still there. In the distance, there was a wooden bench planted along the dirt path. A tall figure was slouched forward on said bench. As Kyle walked closer, he could make out a small pair of bare legs, like someone was sitting in its lap. He wasn't sure if it was Tweak, but he figured he'd be able to tell once he was close enough. A chilly breeze wafted over him from the pond. He shivered as the water rippled and danced. When he glanced back at the bench, he only saw a blonde person with a black jacket draped over his lap. No bare legs, no little person. He found who he was looking for. "Hello?" Kyle offered quietly, which made the blonde jump. He whirled around to find the redhead there, clutching a sketchbook to his chest. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. This is yours." He held the book out for Tweak to take, but the blonde boy just stared dumbly at it. It was almost as if he was sure it was some kind of trap. Oh, and he was. "You dropped it in English class. I've been wanting to return it all day," Kyle said with a small but friendly smile. Not impressed by Kyle's sweetness, Tweak reached up and snatched the book away. He set it in his lap, and the two remained quiet as he skimmed through the sweater-covered pages. Kyle didn't like the implications of it. Still, he didn't say a word until Tweak made it to the blank pages. "See? Just like you left it," Kyle chimed, as if to reaffirm his innocence. Tweak nodded, then gazed back up at the other boy. "What else do you want?" "Huh?" Kyle muttered. "You're still standing here, so there must be something else," Tweak snapped almost bitterly. Kyle's cheeks tinted an annoyed red at the harshness of Tweak's tone. He was hoping for a thank you at least, but it was obvious Tweak wasn't the kind of person who threw out such niceties. He spent his entire day looking for that asshole, for answers. Still, leaving a bad taste in the mouth of the person keeping them probably wasn't the best way to get them. No, Kyle lied. "No, that's all." He turned and stiffly took off in the opposite direction. He didn't know what he expected, really. Such a social recluse surely wasn't going to crack open and spill out all his secrets just because Kyle returned a book. It was then, as he was festering in his doubts, he heard the sound of footsteps thumping in the dirt. Kyle stopped and turned around, where he found Tweak tailing behind him at a distance. "What are you doing?" Kyle asked, while shaking his head.
His exasperation was a little too obvious. "I don't let people walk home alone anymore," Tweak uttered through clenched teeth. "Not when it's getting dark." Kyle was awestruck for a moment, but ultimately ended up nodding slowly in consent. The odd pair walked through the impending night, though Tweak remained lingering quietly in the background. Kyle had to admit how creepy it was being followed by the tall, hooded figure. Neither spoke a single word until they'd already awkwardly shuffled past the lights of the church. "I hope you don't get mad, but I peeked in your sketchbook," Kyle finally confessed to break the silence between him and his new shadow. "I liked all your sweaters. Do you actually make them?" Tweak jerked his head in an awkward nod. He wasn't really used to strangers trying to start up idle chat. Not that Kyle was exactly a stranger, but he might as well been. Tweak rubbed his aching ribs and let out a shaky sigh. They were hurting and tight, like his lungs puffed up like balloons. "I knit sometimes. It's stupid," Tweak finally admitted. Stupid as in it was something the other kids didn't do. Then again, the other kids didn't have a shivering little Craig to keep warm either. "I don't think it's stupid," Kyle commented. "I used to knit sometimes. My mom really loves doing it." Again, Tweak only stiffly nodded. Kyle contemplated a moment how to bring up all the questions he had. He wasn't exactly sure how to ask them. "So, why were you hanging around the pond so late at night?" Kyle questioned while staring at the muck on Tweak's boots. The hooded blonde was finally walking alongside him. Again, Tweak preferred to reply without words. A stiff shrug was about all he could muster. He was worn out, tired, and his heart was all withered up and sad. "Well, you must be pretty brave to hang out around there by yourself," Kyle concluded as the sounds of their footsteps shuffled beneath them. "Especially with the Shadow Man." Suddenly, the street lamps flickered to life above them, making Kyle jump a little. They let out a creepy buzzing, then hummed through the darkening air. Tweak would not reply to Kyle. The subject understandably put his already sore heart in overdrive. As they stepped out from under the safety of a street lamp, Tweak took in Kyle's form in the darkness. His hands went clammy. Kyle was there the night Fat Ass and his friends chased him through the woods. Oh, fucking Jesus. What if it was all a trap? What if this was another fucking attempt at snatching him? "You don't talk much, do you?" Kyle asked quietly. "Everyone's stupid," Tweak suddenly said. "Shadow Man this, Shadow Man that. It's all so dumb." "Well, I guess it'd be a little ridiculous if what they say is true," Kyle said while tapping his chin with his pointer finger. "Murderous ghosts trying to hide bodies?" "It's not true," Kyle said through a tight jaw. There was no point being subtle. He already made up his mind that Kyle was about to ambush him. He was so sure Cartman and the others were hiding around every corner that he flinched every time they passed the side of a house, expecting to get pounced on. Kyle shifted his gaze up to the tall teen beside him. After a moment of consideration, he timidly asked, "Then, what is the truth?" They both went silent as they walked under streetlights. Tweak was ready to start running. He wanted to so badly, but the last time he let someone slip away into the dark of night alone. "I don't know," Tweak muttered the lie. They were all going to jump him and probably beat the shit out of him. Then turn him into the cops and come to his cell, just so they could throw stuff at him from between the bars, like some monkey in a zoo. Oh, Jesus. The least he could do was plead his case. Maybe he's a good guy, you know? Maybe he's trying to do the opposite of what everyone says. Like what? Instead of trying to hide body parts, he's trying to find them? The sentence almost began as a joke, at least, until he reached the punchline. Kyle stopped in his tracks beneath another streetlight, which made Tweak do the same. That's why you're out there digging holes, isn't it? He asked with knit brows. Tweak looked back with wide eyes. His mouth fell open a little as if he wanted to argue, but none of the petrified words he could think of would push past the barrier of his lips. No one would listen to you about Craig, so you've been going out there all this time to find him on your own. Tweak took a step back. His round blue eyes wavered and flicked as if he was searching for an escape. He was awestruck. The gears in his head all fell loose and were rattling around in his brain. Who was this Kyle character? How the fuck could he figure Tweak out so easily? What, me? Tweak blurted while stepping out of the buzzing light of the lamppost they wandered under. I haven't told anyone, Kyle promised before slowly nodding his head. I'm the only one who saw your face. Boom. Tweak was fucking right. The one time he was hoping to be wrong. Oh God, Jesus. What do you want? I don't have a whole lot for you to take. What do you want with me? Wow, no, I'm not trying to blackmail you, Kyle said with his arm shooting up in surrender. I don't know, I just wanted to talk. Why? Are you bugged? Recording all this for one of those news articles or something? Tweak nearly screamed in a frightened voice. You can't turn me in. You can't. I haven't found him yet. I'm not bugged, and I'm not going to turn you in. I wouldn't spend all day searching for you just so I could escort you to the police station, Kyle retorted as he continued on his way home. He treaded off the sidewalk and crossed the street. Perplexed, Tweak wafted after him. Then why? Tweak persisted. Kyle looked down at his feet. He literally had Tweak right where he wanted him. All he had to do was spill the beans about his gift. 'Cause I see dead people, and I want to know why your precious Craig tried to rip my face off, was a good way to start. Or he could go more subtle with the simple, I get psychic visions when I touch things, and I can't even sleep since you grabbed my hand. There were 1,000 ways he could have said it, but when he was there, side by side with the legendary Shadow Man, he couldn't even open his mouth. He rubbed his temples and exhaled. I guess I was just curious about you. The suspicious look Tweak gave him was more than enough to prove he didn't believe Kyle. Not for a moment. Kyle rubbed his yarn bracelet with his thumb as he saw his house tucked alongside the others on his sleepy street. And I never knew anyone who could see them like I can. You see dead people too? Yeah, sure. Tweak laughed in disbelief. Kyle was almost shocked at first to hear such utter doubt, at least until he remembered every psychic he'd ever seen on a TV show. People loved to pretend. Craig's eyes are ripped out of his head, Kyle said as he nodded away the chilling memory. Tweak gawked at the other with eyes as big as the moon rising overhead, but that's where the conversation ceased. They'd finally reached Kyle's house. Tweak stood on the sidewalk as Kyle stepped up onto his front stoop. He took in a heavy breath before turning back to look at the person behind him. Those icy blue eyes were still locked onto Kyle. The skin around it was pale, giving away just how chill to the bone Tweak had become. Aside from himself, there was no one. No one in his life who had ever seen Craig. He was both astonished and terrified. Kyle nibbled on his bottom lip a moment. Maybe we could meet up again sometime and talk, he suggested. You don't have to be so alone all the time, you know. Immediately, Tweak shook his head no. I don't talk, he nearly hissed. I don't need friends. Kyle looked down at his shoes. That was it for tonight. The door closed behind him, and Tweak was left staring at the pristine, polished wood.